So let's talk about Benjamin Britten. He's one of Britain's most celebrated composers, for sure. But, to really get his music, this revolutionary stuff he was writing, you've got to understand the man himself. His art was basically forged in this crucible of a lifetime spent as an outsider. Queerness can never define an identity. It can only ever disturb one. This quote from the scholar Lee Edman, it really gets to the heart of Britten. See, his art wasn't just him holding up a mirror to his identity as an outsider. No, it was way more active than that. It was a force of disruption. It was his way of challenging, of unsettling, the same world that was putting him on a pedestal. And that right there, that's the central tension we're going to explore. On one hand, you've got this celebrated public figure, right? A pillar of British culture. But on the other, you have a man who, in private, was in this deep conflict with the very society that was celebrating him. And that conflict, it became the engine for his greatest work. Okay, so first things first. To really get Britten's music, we gotta understand the world he was pushing up against. And the contrast is, well, it's pretty stark. You look at post-war Britain, it's all about national pride, that sense of wartime unity, but it was also a place where being gay was literally a crime. Now you look at Britten, he was a lifelong pacifist, a conscientious objector, and he felt totally ostracized during the war. He was living openly with his partner, the tenor Peter Pears, and he even called himself a self outside of society. So this wasn't just, a feeling. This was a fundamental clash of values. So the big question is, how does all this personal conflict actually turn into public art? And I mean, you can see it everywhere in his work, from the haunted music of The Turn of the Screw all the way to the grand opera Billy Budd. But maybe the most powerful early example, that would be his groundbreaking 1945 opera Peter Grimes. This is where Britten really puts the outsider front and center. The story of the opera it's devastatingly simple. You've got this fisherman, Peter Grimes. He's cleared of his apprentice's death, but it doesn't matter. The community, his town, just keeps hounding him with suspicion and judgment. And in the end, it completely destroys him. It's just this raw look at what exclusion, what a mob mentality can do to a person, the psychological toll of it all. And you can see this tragic progression play out. First, there's the inquest. That's the formal part. It's supposed to deliver justice, but it doesn't get rid of the suspicion. And that suspicion just sits there and ferments until another accident happens, and boom, the community turns into a vengeful mob. And in the end, Grimes is completely exiled, totally broken, and he's basically told by his own community to go kill himself. It's a chilling story about how a society can just systematically crush a person. And if you had any doubt that this was all connected to his own life, Britten said it himself. He and his partner Piers, they saw their own experience as pacifists during the war right there in that story of the individual against the crowd. So for Britten, Peter Grimes wasn't just some character in an opera. He was a vessel for his own feelings of alienation. All right, so Peter Grimes shows us the what, right? The story of the outsider. Now let's dig into the how. What was the core philosophy that drove Britten to create art like this in the first place? Well, there's this concept called queering as action. And the idea is pretty simple. Art isn't a mirror, it's a hammer. For Britten, composing wasn't just a passive thing, like saying, hey, look at me, I'm an outsider. No way. It was an active weapon. And he would do this in the music itself. He'd pit a really sweet melody against a jarring, dissonant harmony. Or he'd use this sparse, unsettling instrumentation to just pull the rug out from under you. It was all about destabilizing the very social and musical norms that were creating outsiders to begin with. And there's no better example of this idea of art as disruption, no place where it's more powerfully realized, than in what many people call his ultimate masterpiece, the War Requiem. Now, the context here is just so important. This piece was commissioned for the rededication of the new Coventry Cathedral. It was built right next to the ruins of the old one, which had been destroyed in a WW2 bombing raid. So this piece was meant to be this big symbol of peace and reconciliation. But Britten, ever the pacifist, he had a much more radical idea. So what Britten did was he structured the whole piece with these two conflicting musical layers. The first layer is what you could call the home front. It's the grand public ritual of mourning. You've got the traditional Latin Requiem Mass sung by a soprano, a huge chorus, and a full symphony orchestra. It sounds exactly like what you'd expect from a conventional, state-sanctioned ceremony of grief. But then, Britten throws in the war front, and these musicians are physically separated from the main orchestra. It's just two male soloists and a small chamber group, and they're singing in English. And their words? It's not the sacred liturgy. It's the brutally realistic war poetry of Wilfred Owen, a soldier from World War I. This is the voice of the soldiers themselves, intimate, gritting, and real. And these two layers are in constant conflict. You'll hear the main chorus singing this beautiful sacred plea for eternal rest in Latin, and then the soloists just cut in with Owen's ferocious English poetry, which often directly contradicts the religious text. What you get is this incredibly tense musical dialogue between the public ritual and the private, hidden trauma. And it all leads to this one small but absolutely devastating change at the very end. The traditional prayer is Dona eis pacem, which means grant them peace. But Britten has the tenor, who is the voice of the soldier, change one word. He sings Dona nobis pacem, grant us peace. It's this final, defiant act of separation. He's claiming a personal peace, one that's totally distinct from the one the crowd is praying for. So this refusal to just wrap things up with a nice, simple, unified message, that really brings us to the core of Britten's whole philosophy as an artist. He just wasn't interested in giving his audience easy answers. He was a huge believer in something his friend, the poet W.H. Auden, called parable art. And the idea is basically this. An artist's job isn't to preach a sermon or give you a lecture. Their job is to present a complex situation, a story, a parable, and then force you, the audience, to wrestle with it and figure it out for yourself. Just like Auden said, you cannot tell people what to do, you can only tell them parables. And that's Britten to a T. Whether it's the tragic story of Peter Grimes or the intense, unresolved tension of the War Requiem, he never tells you what to think. He just presents the conflict and leaves the moral heavy lifting up to you. And so that leaves us with a final question. Britten's music consistently gives this powerful, unapologetic voice to the outcast, to the individuals standing against the crowd. So in our world today, which is still so full of division, his work kind of forces us to ask ourselves, what is that outsider's voice trying to tell us right now?